In 1954, William Golding wrote a novel called Lord of the Flies. It's about a group of boys that get stranded on an island, and without civilization or any adults around, they quickly descend into bloodthirsty, savage chaos. How many of you have heard of Lord of the Flies? Most of us. It's often listed as one of the greatest novels of all time, and rarely in history has a novel been so celebrated for and so admired for articulating so much truth about human nature. And the specific idea in this book is that civilization is just a thin veneer over humankind, keeping us just barely from acting out our selfish, brutal human nature. This idea is called veneer theory. I think of it as the secular counterpart of original sin. But friends, I want to give you some good news. The book isn't true. Of course, it's fiction, but it's even more not true than that. Just 11 years after Lord of the Flies was published, an actual group of 6 teenage boys crash-landed on an actual abandoned island in Tonga. They were stuck there for 15 months, a real-life Lord of the Flies scenario. You might be, as I was, curious about what happened next. But in this true version of the story, things turned out very different. The boys started a fire, and they cooperated to keep it burning without stopping for 15 months, the whole time they were there. They divided up the labor, and they teamed up in pairs to plant and tend a garden, to keep chickens in pens, to cook for each other in their ad hoc kitchen, and to make a guitar out of junk because they sang together every morning and every night. When one of the boys fell and broke his arm, the others made a makeshift cast, and they took on extra work to take care of him. Now, how many of you have heard of the real-life boys stranded on an actual desert island who created a magical society of cooperation and community care? Just like 2 of us. All right, my housemate, surprise. Because every night at dinner, I'm like, have you guys heard of this? All right, listen up, people. If you have heard of the Lord of the Flies, but you have not heard of the actual story of the Tonga boys, it's because the cynics are winning. I don't believe in original sin, and I don't believe in veneer theory, but I do believe that some people think they have something to gain by repeating these bogus stories. And the cynics I'm talking about are the people most invested in the status quo of an unjust society, and they are the people for whom success means profiting from our fear and our despair. In the news media, there's a saying, if it bleeds, it leads. And researchers found that in the 90s and 2000s, plane travel became safer and safer every year. But because plane crashes became more rare, they became more newsworthy. So the media reported on them more and more. The result was that in general, people became much more afraid of flying during this time. I remember these years. I remember myself getting more anxious about flying. But when we get more and more scared about something that is getting safer and safer, we know the cynics are winning. And social media companies in recent years, they've taken that business model of the news and they've put it on steroids so that they profit from fear and despair way beyond what the news stations of the 90s could have ever dreamed about. A few months ago, I heard a relative say that they didn't trust people who were happy. They clearly weren't paying attention. They weren't paying attention to the state of the world. Happiness wasn't rational, they said, and so it showed poor judgment. It reminded me of a bumper sticker that I have long lived by that says, if you aren't angry, you aren't paying attention. And there is truth in that. But I want to also share some evidence for hope that makes optimism also rational. For a couple of reasons. First, because to not acknowledge the way things are getting worse can be to turn away from those who are suffering. But to not acknowledge the way things are getting better is to erase the work of people who have made a real difference in their lives. And the powerful people who want things to stay the way they are or maybe get worse, well, those folks would love nothing more for us than to give up on the idea of progress altogether. If you want more people to work for justice, friends, what better tool can we offer than a story that proves change is possible? Being honest about good news not only makes for less anxious air travel, but it makes for stronger justice movements. And this is personal because I recognize that in recent years, I have become more despairing about the possibility for good, and it has meant less activism in my own life. So my heart and my work are in desperate need of some good news. And lastly, a religious community, if it isn't fundamentalist, should challenge us to hold the complexity of this world. It's true that things are getting worse. It's also true that things are getting better. Truth-seeking as a spiritual practice means holding the complexity of both of these stories. So here's my 3 reasons to tell the story of good news and celebrate real wins. Are you ready, slide man? Number 1, to honor rather than erase the work of the people that have made things better. Number 2, to offer fuel to a movement working for change. And number 3, because celebrating progress, in addition to grieving injustice, is the honest thing to do. All right, are you ready? Here's my list of good news that I brought for you tonight. In healthcare, we now, thank God, have drugs that can make HIV undetectable for the increasing number of people that have access to them. And last year was the lowest number of new HIV infections since 1990. In fact, this is true around the world for deaths from all diseases, all infectious diseases, which have been cut down by 1/3 in that amount of time. Despite the anti-vax movement here in the States, vaccinations for children around the world have absolutely skyrocketed, and child mortality around the world is less than half of what it was just 30 years ago. The year my dad was born, life expectancy in the world averaged 45 years old. Today, it's 72. And as somebody who just turned 42, I am particularly grateful for this one. Friends, in the spirit of celebrating some good news where we can find it, can I get an amen or at least a right on? For the first 30 years of my life, the prison population in the US went up and up, devastatingly so. But we are now headed in the other direction. Did you know that? In recent years, 9 different states have moved to end cash bail, and there's 300,000 fewer people incarcerated in the United States than 10 years ago. Here in Massachusetts, that's good, huh? Here in Massachusetts, the prison population is half of what it was 10 years ago. Thank God for the largely young Black activists and communities of color that have changed the trajectory of mass incarceration. Dayenu. Can I get a right on or an amen? I'll bet you didn't think I was going to talk about climate because there's some reason for depression there. But let me tell you this. Climate scientists believe that the average carbon emissions per person have peaked and they are now falling. Did you know that? 10 years ago, we were headed toward global warming of 4 to 5 degrees. But policy changes around the world means that we're now on track for about 2.5 degrees. 2.5 degrees is not great, but it is so incredibly, wonderfully better than 5 degrees. And the fact that that change happened so quickly should be a story that can only add fuel, and I mean renewable fuel, to our movement for more change ahead. Thank God for the tens of thousands of activists around the world who made it their business to make this difference. Dayenu, can I get a right on? And lastly, I want to celebrate a really big win with a really boring name. The Inflation Reduction Act was passed in August 2 years ago here in the US. It is the largest piece of climate legislation any country on the planet has ever enacted. In all my years as a climate activist, I never thought we would win something like this. And on the days that I dared to dream of it, I thought, surely there will be dancing in the streets. It's not quite the Green New Deal that many of us hoped and worked for. But even adjusted for inflation, it is bigger than the original New Deal of the 30s. Did you know that? It will transform our systems of energy and transportation, cutting our country's emissions in half, while taxing the rich to do it. And weirdly, I'll add, it will lower drug costs for seniors by $287 billion. If you know a senior that has struggled with drug costs, this act is huge. Can I get a right on? Dianu. At our last worship gathering, Shia shared a beautiful letter to their younger self, inviting an approach to justice work that was more inclusive and more spiritually grounded. And I've been thinking of what letter I would write to my 22-year-old self. And one thing it would certainly say is to quit being a yes, but activist. So many times when my dad would share some good justice work that his congregation was doing, my response would be a feeling of distance from him. I would say, yes, but that's not the kind of work that's most needed right now. Or when a friend would share some gratitude for some small progress in their community, I would shake my head in disappointment at how irrational their gratitude was. And I'd say, yes, but it's not enough. Friends, yes, butism does not build winning coalitions. It doesn't celebrate communities when they have worked and won real change, and it falsely oversimplifies the truth of things. Yes, butism is the work of cynics who want us to scroll on our phones instead of using them to call our representatives and our neighbors and our comrades. Our Calvinist ancestors believed that you could tell a religious person because gloom and melancholy were the clearest signs of a wise and religious person. I'm here to tell you, I am no Calvinist. And so I want to invite, right on, thank you. I think they were wrong. And so I want to invite my younger self, and I'm going to be honest, I want to invite my today self to the spiritual practice of yes and. I believe that if you're not angry, you're not paying attention, yes. And I believe that if you are not cultivating joy, you are withholding important fuel from the movement. I believe that with so much suffering in the world, happiness can show a lack of empathy, yes. And I believe that compassion also demands that we celebrate progress when we find it. I've got another list for you. Here's what I want you to do with good news when you find it. Number 1, throw more parties. Parties are a solution to the epidemic of loneliness and isolation that are plaguing our people. They help build communities, which are the building blocks of strong movements. And parties can come in all shapes and styles and sizes, so throw the party that's right for you and your people. For extra credit, come to the anniversary party for the Inflation Reduction Act that I will be throwing in August. Number 2. Say your gratitudes before bed and say them out loud to others. The scientists tell us that saying gratitudes every day improves your mental health, it improves your sleep, and it lowers your chance of heart attacks. Cultivating gratitude is good for you, it is good for justice work, and it's honest because there is a long list of things to be grateful for. For extra credit, sign up for Sanctuary's new gratitude team in this year's survey. And number 3, can we get these here? We're up to number, we got one more. Yep, there we go. One more. Yes. Tell the social media companies who built their fortunes on the backs of our mental health to cut this shit out. Algorithms are choices made by people, and our online gathering places are increasingly shaped by algorithms to feed despair and division, because despair keeps you doom scrolling, which is good for their business model. Friends, I'm not here to tell you that it isn't worse out there than you think. It is worse than you think. Yes, and it is also better than you think. Beloveds, may we hold the complexity of yes and, that the world is both worse and better than we can possibly wrap our hearts around. May we honor the justice makers and the daily task doers who have made a real difference in real people's lives. May we celebrate the change that proves change is possible. May we celebrate each step toward freedom as if it were enough, and then start out on the next step. May we sing each verse as if it were the whole song, and then sing the next verse. I invite you to rise in body or spirit and join me in singing Keep On Moving Forward, all the verses.